up, everybody? Welcome back to class. Okay, this is going to be the final extra credit lecture that I'm releasing for quarter three. So you can take advantage of this. You don't have to watch it. It's not required viewing, but you can take advantage of it and do the corresponding assignment to boost your grade up. Or if you're already at an A, this might be worth your while anyways. I think it's some pretty interesting stuff that I'm talking about, and know that it's near and dear to my heart because I'm getting into some really specific examples here of men that did a lot and contributed to the time period in history that we are covering right now. Now, of course, neither of my grandpas were famous people or presidents or generals or anything like that, but I think it'll give you some insight into what average people were experiencing through the time period that we've been covering recently. So they would both be part of what was called the greatest generation. Pretty extreme billing, right? I mean, to call any group of people, any group of Americans, the greatest generation. But think about the times that they lived through and they grew up in. They were born in the Roaring 20s, but as pretty essentially poor farm kids from very humble and modest beginnings. It's not like they were going out to speakeasies and jazz clubs and bootlegging with Al Capone. They grew up on the farm, and they probably, a lot of the Roaring 20s passed them by, and they were really too young to appreciate those good times. Then through their formative years, they were growing up and kind of going to school during the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in American history. So, extreme suffering and hardships that they were brought up in through their formative years. And then both of my grandpas were at prime fighting age when World War II broke out. And of course, that conflict, to win it and make the world safe for democracy, required all kinds of sacrifice and courage from these guys. So, this is a subjective thing, but I definitely think that my grandpas are part of the greatest generation. And I feel like future generations, my generation and yours, can actually learn a lot from this wonderful group of Americans and human beings, really. Now, I want to say, before I start rolling and go through and cover each of my grandpa's experiences, I have a ton of gratitude. I'm a blessed person because I had such a wonderful upbringing and family. Do I have the gratitude because of my dashing good looks and my charming personality and my gift of gab? Well, maybe a little bit, right? But that's not exactly what I'm getting at. I actually just had an all-around great childhood. I had wonderful parents. I had an awesome brother, all kinds of, a whole slate of cool aunts and uncles. I got a couple kooky uncles out there, but, I love them anyway. And the icing on the cake to it all was I had 4 awesome grandparents that were both a huge part of my life and really impacted me through my formative years. So I do feel very blessed that I had that experience growing up. I guess that's what I have for my intro. Let's get into Grandpa Stan's story now. Okay, so here we go. Grandpa Stan, or Stanley Taluki, he was actually born here in Jackson, Michigan, but his family, so Grandpa Stan's dad, who was named Walenti, actually was born in Poland and had migrated over here in the early 1900s. So to give you a frame of reference, I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but like Teddy Roosevelt would have been president. Another one of my favorite guys that I covered quite a bit in class. Anyway, they had come in through New York and Ellis Island. They end up, I guess the last name used to be a little bit longer. It was like there was a ski at the end of it, but coming through Ellis Island, they kind of Americanized the name and shortened it up a little bit to Taluki, which is what you'd be familiar with now. And they moved to Jackson, Michigan, which apparently a lot of the people from their town in Poland had moved and migrated to Jackson. And there was a pretty big Polish community kind of on the south side of Jackson back in that era. Eventually, though, my great grandpa moved to the family property that is still in the family today, which a lot of you have probably driven by it, whether you realize it or not. It's kind of by Ives Farm Market, and there was a Taluki Farm Market there a few years ago. That farmhouse was actually where my grandpa Stan was born. And, hearing stories about his childhood, like from before World War II, he always emphasized to me that they were very poor, like materially. they didn't have that much. They're poor immigrants coming in. Now, of course, my grandpa's not an immigrant. He was born here, but immigrant family, right? Materially, they didn't have much money at all. But my grandpa also always emphasized to me, he always felt loved. He had a very big family. I think it was nine brothers and sisters. So there was a lot of Talukis there. And maybe some of you know more Talukis around town. If they're in the Jackson area and have the last name Taluki, they're probably related to me somehow. Anyway, he said he always felt loved. And one thing that he also emphasized to me was they always had enough to eat. They always had food on the table because a lot of his early memories are from after the stock market crash of 1929 and on into the 1930s, kind of through his formative years where he really could recall a lot of it. And, that's the worst economic downturn in American history where people were literally starving to death. So that was one thing he always emphasized to me, that even though they were pretty poor, very modest family, very humble. He was born right in the old farmhouse. He didn't go get born or give birth in a hospital back in that era. He said, at least we always had food on the table. And part of that was living on a farm. And a lot of hard work came along with that. But they had food on the table and they could make ends meet and get by. Now, another story that's always stuck with me, and I remember him telling me this multiple times, that, I would, as a kid, get excited for Christmas. And I'd always spend Christmas with, of course, my parents and family. And I would always see both sides of the family, both sets of grandparents. And, the era I'm growing up, I'm looking forward to toys or video games and all kinds of cool little gadgets I'm going to get. And he would, it made an impression on me at a young age when I would talk to him about his experiences for Christmas back when he was a kid, because they didn't have money to buy any presents. I mean, you didn't even have, plastic toys and action figures. That stuff didn't really exist yet. And televisions, radios, that kind of stuff, radios are even kind of new technology when he was growing up, and it caught on. And average American families had it, but they didn't have even one of those in their house. Certainly no video games or television or things like that. And he said that what he would get excited for Christmas time was he would get fruit in a stocking. So think about that. I know we have a whole spectrum and wealthier families and families that do struggle more, around our community and state and nation today. But even a lot of the poorest kids that live below the poverty line today, most of them can expect a little bit more than a banana or an orange for Christmas time. So just trying to put that in perspective for what it was like growing up. I mean, he literally would get excited about getting some fruit, some food that he wouldn't normally get to eat, and mixing it up. And that was what he got for Christmas. Now, he went to a one-room schoolhouse. I believe he went up to about a 6th or 7th grade education, and also would be working on the farm quite a bit, helping to support the family. And he did not go all the way through and complete like a high school degree. That wasn't, a lot of people did by this era, but a lot of Americans also did not. It was pretty normal for most kids to go through and, get at least a grammar school or elementary school education where they would learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and all that. But then a lot of times it's very common once you got to about your teenage years or so, you might leave school and go and do things to help support the family. And that was the case with Grandpa Stan. Now, he started actually building a house and was going to build right on the family property. The house still stands there today. My grandparents lived in that house for their whole lives. He had started building that house. He met my grandma, Helen, which, let me skip on through to the next slide here. Oops, I think I went too far. Here we go. Grandma Helen, here's the family pictures, a little bit blurry there. Anyway, he met my Grandma Helen, who is also an amazing, wonderful person that deserves her own lecture on her as well. But anyway, they got married. They had a child, which was my Aunt Mary, who is an awesome person as well that I'm still very close to this day. And they had started building their house on the family property. Had dug the basement out, and he actually did this all himself. And was out there with a wheelbarrow and a shovel. And I think they were using the family mule to go scoop loads of dirt out. And by the time he had the basement foundations all set and kind of the ground floor, that was when the Pearl Harbor attack happened. And that was one of those like epic moments in American history where most people that were old enough when that happened, they could recall exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard of that attack, because you knew life was going to change. Anyway, America is now in this massive conflict that's already been going on for a few years, but now we're involved in it, and our young boys are going to be going overseas to fight too. Well, Grandpa ended up getting drafted shortly after that. The house was not finished. So he had to say goodbye to his young bride and his baby girl, Aunt Mary, and he was going off to boot camp in Texas to get trained and then going to get deployed over to Europe. He was in one of the earlier waves of soldiers that was getting put into the military and going through boot camp. So remember, like I had said back in some of my previous lectures, initially Germany was seen as the bigger threat. So early on in the war, 90% of our manpower and resources was going over to the European theater. So really both of my grandpas got caught up in that, and they were getting sent over to fight the Nazis first, as we thought they were the more pressing threat in the war. He went to boot camp in Texas. I remember my grandma told me stories about she actually had made a trip down there to visit him after he was going through his weeks of training and all that and running and calisthenics, and she had remarked about how he had lost quite a bit of weight. He wasn't eating a lot, and then on all that military training, he had his belt down to the last notch in it, and she actually took him out to dinner one night before he was going to get deployed, and they were kind of embarrassed by it, but he ordered 2 dinners back to back because he was so darn hungry from all of the training and cows and probably the crappy military food that he had been eating that wasn't nearly as appetizing. So once he gets, let me skip on to the next slide again here. Once he is off fighting in the war and getting deployed, he is going to get stationed in Patton's Third Army. Now, you remember me talking about General Patton quite a bit. I remember my grandpa always remarking and giving me stories about how his general, who I think he held in pretty high regard and had a good opinion, a positive opinion of him, was nicknamed Old Blood and Guts. And the joke about that the soldiers would always tell was, it's our blood and his guts, because Patton was one of the most aggressive generals that we had, who was always pushing forward and taking the fight to the Germans. For what it's worth, too, I guess the German generals and leadership regarded Patton as our best general. Now, you might remember, too, Patton was a little bit of a controversial guy who got himself into trouble from time to time, and a lot of the other Allied generals actually didn't like him all that much. But apparently most of the soldiers that were in his units and division generally did like him and thought he was a good quality general. Anyway, my grandpa didn't know him personally because he was a machine gunner in the Third Army, it was called. So by the time my grandpa gets over there and is actually fighting, he spent some time stationed in southern England, but he really kind of joins into the fighting after the D-Day attack. So he wasn't part of like the landing at Omaha or Utah Beach, but shortly thereafter, a few weeks beyond, if you remember kind of that opening scenes and part of Saving Private Ryan, when, we're pushing away from the beaches and on and through to northern France, that's when he would have joined up with Patton's army, when Patton basically got his command back and they're out there fighting. So he would have fought through the Battle of the Bulge, and actually there's a list, a battle record right here. Probably can't read too good, but if you're ever interested, I could send you a copy of that where you could zoom in on it and you could see all the engagements his unit fought in throughout the war. So he was basically over there from like post D-Day on, seeing combat right on through to the end of the war. Let me give you a couple of his other stories now. From the time I was born on, from my earliest memories, Grandpa Stan always was hard of hearing, especially at one of his ears. Man, he just, like, if you talk to him and happened to be sitting on that side, he would say, and kind of give you a come again. And apparently he had major hearing loss from his experiences in World War II. How he had explained it to me was, he was in combat situations numerous times, and once a German grenade went off right on the side of him. And those things, if you've never been around like a cannon explosion, or none of us would probably be around any grenades going off, but anything that's a really just massive explosion like that, man, it does give you some ringing, and you should be wearing ear protections ideally, because it does do damage to your hearing. And honestly, I don't see, as somebody that shoots guns quite a bit too. My grandpa was a machine gunner, and he had a 1911 pistol, which is a 45 caliber, and he would fire those weapons quite a bit. I have a 45 caliber pistol, and I fired it once or twice with my earmuffs off, and man, your ears will be ringing for hours. So these guys that were firing these guns just, all the time and around explosions, I don't see how any of them could hear after the war. I mean, most of them did, but I think a lot of them also had hearing loss from that, because this stuff was just so darn loud. And of course, back in World War II, out in combat, they weren't wearing any kind of ear protection or anything like that. So that was something that he took away from the war, was, he was a little bit hard of hearing for the rest of his life because of those experiences. Another story that I always remember him telling me that really kind of made an impression on me. I asked him if he had ever felt like he came close to dying over there, if he had any close calls. And he said, there a lot of times we were out shooting, we could see the enemy across the field. But the one time that I think that he actually, when he would tell me this story, he often would get a little bit choked up, and it would make him pause. He was out there stationed, and machine gun crews that he were on were like two guys. One guy, like my grandpa, was firing the gun, and another guy was helping to get ammo around and reload it. Well, they would cycle guys in and out, because obviously you can't fight for 24/7, day after day after day. You're going to get too exhausted. So you got to give your soldiers a break so that they can come sleep. Well, he was relieved one day after his shift by, he said it was a Latino guy that had come in that he was kind of friends with from the unit. He knew who he was, not best buddies, but a guy he was familiar with. And he was coming in and taking control of that machine gun, and that was going to be his post. So my grandpa and his partner cycled out of there. And about 8 hours later, after my grandpa had went and gotten some sleep and came back, and now it was his shift again, he showed back up, and the Latino guy, and I'm not sure about his partner, I guess he was just gone, but the guy that had relieved him was there dead, had been shot by the Germans. So my grandpa always, probably rightfully assumed that had he just had the opposite shift, if he had been, if that had been flip-flopped, he probably would have been the one there lying dead, instead of, his comrade in arms, the guy that, unfortunately, I don't know his name. But anyway, I guess fortunately for Grandpa Stan and my family, it didn't pan out that way. Next up, I want to talk about POWs. Actually, before I get to that, I also asked my grandpa, like, did you ever shoot any Germans, like, out in the action? As a little kid, I wanted to know and hear those, like, action and kind of gory stories. And I'll say, a lot of soldiers will maybe have like PTSD, you might be familiar with, and their experiences in combat really scar them and change who they are. And it's also very common for a lot of veterans to not want to talk about their experiences at all. One thing I'll say, both of my grandpas were pretty open and upfront with me, and they actually liked talking about their experiences in the war. I also have a strong hunch that there was a lot of stuff he didn't tell me, that he didn't want to tell, his little grandkid when I was 10, 12, 14, 15 years old, and talking to him about these experiences. And sometimes I'd actually catch Grandma Helen saying, you know what I mean, kind of cutting him off in the story. But as for did he ever shoot any Germans, he said, honestly, it was really, really hard to tell, because there was a lot of times he was shooting at Germans that were off in the distance, kind of across the field. But as soon as his machine gun would start firing, they would all drop. So a lot of times he couldn't tell if he had hit them, or if, even if a machine gun, if you were shooting in the air, they're going to drop and take cover because they don't want to get shot. So he said sometimes he thought he maybe got some Germans, but it was really hard to actually confirm that you got somebody for the kind of combat he was experiencing. Now, later on, towards the end of the war, remember I've talked about how the Germans and the Japanese had a very different mentality. I'm actually glad both of my grandpa's experiences were in the European theater rather than the Pacific theater, because some of the fighting from the Pacific theater just sounds all war is horrific and rotten, but man, we've talked about how the Japanese just would not surrender and they would fight to the last man. Fortunately for the Allied armies fighting in the European theater, even though Hitler had given the order that we're all going to fight to the last man and you fight to the death, your average German soldier wasn't going to follow that order. Culturally, they're fairly similar to us. And once they would get into hopeless situations, and I'm talking in the final few months of the war, lots of German units were surrendering and becoming POWs to the Allied armies coming in. And my grandpa said in the closing months of the war, his unit had taken tons of POWs, had lots of Germans surrender to them. Now, of course, when you would get German POWs surrendering, you have to disarm them first and you take things of value off of them. You want to make sure you have their pistols, their knives, and all that. Which actually, I don't have a photo of this on the picture of him, but he did get, all soldiers were allowed to take one German pistol with them if they were able to come across one or get one. And my grandpa had a really cool officer pistol, a German Mauser, a little kind of almost like a little pocket pistol. It's a 25 caliber that your average soldier, enlisted man, wouldn't have had one of those, but officers did. And my grandpa had one of those, and it's in perfect condition. And we actually have it in a family safe today. And that's something that's a family heirloom that we'll hold on to forever. We don't plan on selling it or anything because it goes back to grandpa's war experiences. Anyway, he said the German soldiers would surrender, and he remembered you were supposed to take watches and wallets and all of that kind of material off of them too. And my grandpa had a soft heart, and he was a really kind guy. And he remembered one time taking a watch off of a German that was surrendering. And when he took the watch from him, the German guy was teared up and said, "No, mein Frau," was trying to say, "Mein Frau, it was my wife gave me this." And, the policy was the policy, so he took it anyway. But he said that was one of his regrets from the war, that guy didn't seem like some hardened Nazi. He seemed like an average German soldier in the Wehrmacht, and he always kind of regretted taking that watch from that particular soldier. But that was, the Army policy at the time. Now, another story that always stuck with me. This was one that I think he snuck past Grandma Helen that I'm sure she would not have approved me hearing of. But apparently, and this is not something that was standard Army policy that was being advertised, but there was kind of the attitude that, hey, average German soldiers, just the guys in the Wehrmacht, the normal German GIs, those guys will accept their surrender from. We're going to put them in POW camps, and they can eventually be kind of rehabilitated and return to normal life after the war. But then there were also the very hardcore Nazis, the SS, the Schutzstaffel that we've talked a little bit about. Those were the guys that would run units like the Einsatzgruppen and that were out murdering the Jews, the mobile killing squads, okay? Well, there were SS soldiers, the guys from SS units that would be stationed in regular Army units too. And those were the guys that were the diehard Nazis, that were the true believers. And it was kind of assumed, and I think this is probably correct, that those guys, there was no rehabilitating them. They were the true believers, and they were there to try to make sure that the rest of those German soldiers did put up a good fight and didn't surrender. Anyway, my grandpa said that it was really common when a German unit would surrender, that often the German soldiers would point out guys that were in the SS, because the SS guys would not be wearing their black uniforms that set them aside, because they knew that would make them a target. So they would typically, even if they were in the SS, they would dress in, a normal Wehrmacht uniform. And the German soldiers would actually point out who the SS guys were, because they didn't like them either. They thought they were rotten sons of guns too. And my grandpa told me that, the average German soldiers would be taken as POWs, put to the back of the line, and they're going to be in a prison camp until the end of the war, and they can get cycled out. But they would not put the SS guys in there, and they didn't advertise this, but he said his commanding officer would actually kind of ask him something like, any of you guys want to volunteer to take the trash out? And that was code or slang for, we're going to take these SS guys out back and basically just execute them and shoot them. And I asked my grandpa, I was like, well, did you ever do that? And he said, no, I didn't really want to be an executioner. And I think I do believe him in that. Like, I just kind of reading his body language and knowing who he was as a person, I don't think that's something that would have been up his alley. But he also said, made the comment to me that there was never any shortage of guys that were willing to do that. Anyway, hey, desperate times, desperate measures. And when we're talking about SS soldiers, they are the worst of the worst and pretty rotten guys. So no sympathy from me for any of them. That goes through a lot of my grandpa's war stories. One that was always heartbreaking to me personally, and this might not seem like a very big deal at all, but I'm a history guy, and I also like guns. I've talked to you guys about that a little bit, that, I go out shooting. That's one of my big hobbies. Anyway, one of the pistols that is my main one that I will carry when I do carry is a 1911. Now, mine's in 1911, for me to explain a little bit, is it was the standard. It's a model of pistol that originally was made by Colt, and that was the standard American sidearm for the U.S. military from World War I through to the Vietnam War. Okay, so a very iconic American pistol. I would imagine if I threw a picture of one up, most of you would say like, "Oh yeah, I've seen that." It was what Major Whittlesey was carrying in the Lost Battalion movie, or it was what Sergeant Horvath had when we watched some scenes from Saving Private Ryan. Okay. Anyway, my grandpa had one of those. He carried it on him as a machine gunner. He would also have a pistol with him, and he carried that through the whole war. Well, I guess it was government policy at the time that, you could take one German souvenir pistol with you, or like some German armbands, like I have photographs of, and other souvenirs like that. But anything that was U.S. military property, that had to be turned in at the end of the war. Now, granted, there were millions and millions of these pistols, and it was very hard for the military to keep track of them. Well, they were told to turn all that stuff in, and this is after the war when they're on the boat ride home. Well, my grandpa said he kept that pistol on him. He didn't go turn it in. And he was they were back into the States, getting ready to unload off of the boat. And his sergeant came through and said, "None of you guys better have anything on you. You shouldn't. We're checking you for pistols. We're going to strip search you and stuff like that." Something to that effect. And it scared my grandpa. And, he was so excited and ready to get back home and get out of the uniform and back to normal life and see his family, that he didn't want any hassles like that. So I guess he kind of ditched the pistol and just threw it in the latrine bathroom area. And then he got off the boat. And then he said, the sergeant, the officers, they never searched him. He would have been able to walk right through with it out in his belt. Now, maybe Grandpa shouldn't have done that and should have just turned it in when he should have. But man, I've always wished, Grandpa, why did you do that? Why didn't you smuggle it out of there? Because what a cool what a cool little piece of history, and specifically something that my grandpa would have used through the war. I really wish that pistol was still in the family. Man, if you could find the exact one, I would be willing to spend money to get it. But I'm sure it's long gone and lost to history at this point. So, hey, that's the end of my grandpa Stan's story. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Now, after the war, he went on, a lot of soldiers don't want to talk about their experiences, and a lot of guys do get PTSD, and they can't adjust back to regular life. That was not the case with Grandpa Stan. He went on to lead an amazing life, lived up to 89 years old, had a wonderful family. My dad was born shortly after World War II, after Grandpa got back home, and he would be part of the baby boom generation, because as all of these GIs are coming back home, all the soldiers are coming back from the European battlefields, they were all ready to get down to life, or not all of them, but most of them were ready to get back to life and go find a job, get married, or maybe a lot of them were already married, like Grandpa Stan was, and start having babies. So yeah, my dad, Bob Taluki, was part of that baby boom, early baby boom generation. And there you have it. That kind of sums up not everything that my Grandpa Stan experienced, obviously, in World War II, but a lot of his experiences. And right here, let me shrink my face down a little bit for you. Here was a photo. One thing as I was looking through, and there are dozens and dozens, maybe even up 100 or more photos my grandpa had from his experiences in World War II, which most of them are not on here. But here is one of some of his closest friends. And I will say, I've talked a little bit before about how going into combat and dangerous situations, most of those guys, a real common experience is, rather than thinking about lofty goals and about protecting the world and making democracy safe, most guys that go into combat and their life's on the line, they feel like they're doing it for the guy next to them, and they develop really close bonds. They become bands of brothers with their comrades in arms, the other guys in their unit. And one thing I'll say, after looking through Grandpa Stan's photo album, man, it seemed like he had a lot of good friends that he made. Now those guys, I never met any of them and didn't know them, but seemed like he made a lot of good friends over there while he was in the war. This one right here, this good-looking guy, that's Grandpa Stan and two of his other best buddies from the Warriors. Okay, let's move on to Papa Houston. Emmett Houston James, aka Papa Houston to me, which, as a kid, that always confused me a little bit, that both of my grandfathers asked to be called, differently, that it was Grandpa Stan and then Papa Houston, which why that was, I don't know. That was just the way they liked it. Maybe you have similar situations in your family. Anyway, so Papa Houston is actually, his first name was Emmett, but he always has gone by Houston James. Now, his story is a little bit different than my Grandpa Stan's. He actually was born down south in Kentucky, lived in Marion, Kentucky, on through to about when he was in 8th grade. I always liked hearing stories from his childhood too. Kind of similar, but from a different area from my other grandfather, where, he was also kind of modest, humble beginnings, essentially a poor farm kid that, was working on the family farm and then also going to school. One of the stories that always stuck with me from his childhood was that he just said he would always, all summer long, always be barefoot, and his feet would get calloused up, and he could walk across gravel or rocks or whatever, and his feet were so tough that it wouldn't even bother him at all. So, true little hillbilly kid, right? Where, as soon as he can kick those shoes off and it's warm enough, not wearing any footwear, which I always thought that was kind of awesome little story. Anyway, his family moves up to the Detroit area when he's in roughly about 8th grade or so. Now, that is a pretty common thing. We talked about back in class, like the Great Migration in the 1920s or so, where, lots of people, we covered it in class, of like African Americans moving out of the South and coming up to the northern states, and they were getting pushed out of the South because of Jim Crow racism, and then, better jobs up north. Well, hey, actually, that was kind of true for white Southerners too. Not necessarily the racism part of it, but just that there's better opportunities up north. Most people down south, the vast majority, were kind of poor farmers or tenant farmers. Now, my family, Papa Houston's family, owned land and had their own small farm. But if you were willing to leave the farm down in Kentucky, down from the south, and come on up north to the big city, you could make quite a bit more money, because this is at a time too when the auto industry is absolutely booming. Now, Papa Houston actually went to school for quite a bit longer than my Grandpa Stan did. He went through and actually finished high school, and he had a few years of training, like post-high school schooling too. So for that era, for back in that time in history, fairly highly educated, because remember, most people didn't go to college back then. That was only something for the most elite and wealthy of kids and families. So anyway, pretty well educated. And then he is a few years younger than my Grandpa Stan. So when he was, I don't even think, maybe about 20 years old. I should have double checked this. That was when Pearl Harbor happened, and bam, America is getting involved in World War II. Now, he actually ended up enlisting because his draft number had come up. And then if he had just waited for his draft number in the order to report to come through, he almost certainly would have been put into the Army and been out in the general infantry. But he actually had the goal. He wanted to be in the Air Force, which technically there wasn't an Air Force as a separate branch back then. The Air Force was part of the Army, so the Army Air Force. But he wanted to go and fly planes was kind of his goal. So before his draft number totally, comes up, he had a little window of time where he could go enlist. He did do that. And then if you were going to go enlist and just join up on your own, you could select which branch or which units you wanted to go into. Now, his goal was to be a fighter pilot. He was hoping to be a fighter pilot in a P-51 Mustang, which we've covered in class, and I've shown you some good visuals and movie scenes with those in it. But I guess the story goes that his mom really freaked out on him and was worried, and man, that sounds dangerous, which she was right. Being in the Air Force was a very dangerous job. Statistically, that was one of the jobs that was most likely to get you killed in the war. So he ended up opting out, even though would have qualified for flight school, which is kind of a hard thing to do. They don't let just any dummy go fly a plane. You have to pass some tests, and you have to, it's a very strict protocols for who they allow into the pilot school. He would have qualified for that, but at his mother's request, he decided, oh, mom's too worried about me being a fighter pilot, and he opted out and chose to get onto a bomber crew. So he goes through and does all of his training. He actually went to gunnery school out in the Las Vegas area, where apparently he finished 10th out, or at least in the top 10 of 300 guys in his gunnery class, which is pretty darn impressive. So, Papa Houston, pretty darn good shot. Now, they didn't tell him who was the number one, number two, like the top 10 rankings. They just told the guys who were in the top 10. But Papa Houston actually has talked to some of his grandkids about it and said that he thought he actually might have been the number one guy, because on all of the targets, after you would go and do your shooting and then see how you hit, he was like dead center bullseye in every one. So even if somebody else had done the same thing, I guess there would have been a tie then for who was the top gunner in the class. And honestly, there are some people that might say something like that, and you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, you're bragging. But Papa Houston was not a bragger. He is not a braggadocious guy in the least. He's actually a very humble, modest guy. So for him saying that, that makes me think he probably did. Now, if it was my Uncle Scott or my Uncle Craig saying something like that, I'd probably be right to question it. But Papa Houston, I don't know. If he says he was in the top of the mix, I'm sure that that's actually a legit story. So pretty impressive. Hopefully someday I'll be as good a shot as Papa Houston is. Now, he ended up going to Ipswich, England. Okay, I want to make sure I said that right. I think I pronounced it right. And there were air bases all over southern England where guys from the 8th Air Force would be stationed. And really, in the lead up to the D-Day invasion, you would have had Army units all over southern England too, because that's where we were stockpiling manpower and resources for a couple-year period until we were ready to do that final push into Europe. Now, one of the big pluses to pursuing bombing as a strategy of winning the war was that early on, and you remember I showed some scenes from the movie Memphis Belle, and we talked about the Red Tails and some other Air Force related topics throughout this unit, was by pursuing a strategy of daytime and strategic bombing, we were able to take the fight to Germany much quicker than we otherwise would have been. We weren't prepared to land a big ground army in 1942 or 43 into Fortress Europe, but we could start bombing German targets and taking out their factories and softening them up. Now, if you go to 1943, the German Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, was quite strong that year. Casualties were super high in the 8th Air Force. My grandpa actually gets over there, and it would have been the fall of 44, and he fights on through to almost the very tail end of the war until the spring of 1945. So that was kind of his tour of duty, or his experience. Now, by 1944, we had shot down a lot of the German planes. So he would still see the Luftwaffe up. There were times where he saw German planes coming at him, and he was shooting back at him, and the guys in his squadron and crew were. But actually, the German Luftwaffe was softer by 1944. However, Hitler had given an order where he brought a lot of the flat guns and anti-aircraft guns closer. He brought them up from other positions, I think in Italy and in southern Europe, to these German cities that had the factories. So the flak and the anti-aircraft guns and the amount of fire that they would be under was actually far worse in 1944 than it had been in 43. And those are pretty devastating too. A whole lot of bomber crews and B-51s were shot down because of those anti-aircraft guns. Now, Papa Houston was a top turret gunner in a B-17 Flying Fortress. So these guys would have, you know, we were doing daytime bombing, which made you more vulnerable. The enemy, the Germans, could see you when you're coming up to your bombing target. Now, the upside to that, even though it's far more dangerous for our airmen that are flying those missions, you could see your targets much better and you'd be much more accurate with your placement of bombs. My grandpa had said that one of his most chilling experiences from the war was on his very first combat mission as he was coming into the bomb run. And, you know, these planes are super loud and you hear the roar of the engines. And the top turret gunner is actually in a hydraulic turret behind the pilot and co-pilot. So the top turret gunner could be sitting there and chit-chatting, talking with the pilot quite a bit, and could get a nice view of what was coming up ahead. And he said that, man, as he was coming into that very first bomb run on his first mission, he saw the anti-aircraft guns firing off, and like those puffs, those clouds of black smoke up there, and hearing the bangs and stuff, that just gave him chills right down to his spine. And he realized that, man, I'm in it now, and that literally his life is on the line, that this is something that is extremely dangerous that he was just about to go through. And I guess he said he adapted to that as the war went on, that you know, you get used to it, right? You get combat experience and you've gone through it more. So that was the worst time, he said, that first combat experience, but very dangerous thing. And of course, statistically, your 25th or 30th mission is just as dangerous for you as your first one. A lot of times going through it. Now, my papa said that his crew was very close knit. That he had a captain. The captain's a little bit older, the highest ranking guy on the plane, on the crew. That he very much respected his captain. The whole crew got along together, and they were close knit. Now, I showed some scenes out of the movie Memphis Belle. The Memphis Belle was a real crew, but the movie Memphis Belle, and my Papa Houston had watched this one too. He said that, you know, that movie irked him a little bit. Like, it shows B-17s really good. It's an entertaining movie, but through the whole movie, they're all back talking and yelling at the captain and not really following orders. And he said, man, that is not how my crew was. If the captain gave an order, you did it. We did it. We didn't question him. That it was all business and that our lives were on the line, and us functioning together as a team and as a unit was extremely important to all of us because they all wanted to get back home. So, you know, I guess Hollywood often does that with movies to increase the drama and cinematic value. But in real life, I would imagine most of these crews were not like high drama like it would appear in the movies, that they actually probably functioned pretty good and did follow orders. So my grandpa's crew right here, and like his plane, if you remember, again, from the movie The Memphis Belle, that was the first crew in the 8th Air Force to finish its full tour of duty. My grandpa's crew, actually, because they had a very experienced pilot who was a really quality, good pilot, he got eventually pushed into being or rotated into being a lead plane, which that is a very important job because all the other planes in the squadron would queue onto that lead plane, and they would follow in a fairly tight formation. And when the lead plane gets over the bomb run and the bomb target, and he drops his bombs, then the rest of the planes, that's their cue too as well. So lead plane is a super important role. It's also kind of dangerous because a lot of times the Luftwaffe, if there are fighter planes coming up, that's who they're going to key in on and try to target, is that lead plane to take them out. Now, lead planes, I guess, would get cycled. The actual plane you flew in would get rotated in and out, where they had some very new state-of-the-art radar equipment on these. And also the lead planes, if you were on a lead plane crew, you would fly more training missions. You'd get more time up than the average crew would. But because your plane would get cycled in and out, you wouldn't actually get your logo or your plane's name painted on the front nose of the plane. It kind of showed that in the movie Memphis Belle, and you can go look up other bomber crews and see what their logo was, what they had painted on the nose of the plane. Well, my grandpa's crew, the plane was, even though they didn't have one specific plane, but the crew's name was the Cultured Vulture, which I thought was a pretty awesome one. And actually, cool little story, Papa Houston, who was always a great artist and drawer, he was the one that drew this up, which I thought, man, that's so awesome and cool. And I really like the logo a lot too. So cultured spelled with a K, the Cultured Vulture. And then notice the skull down here that the vulture is standing on. It has a little Hitler mustache and Hitler haircut. So it's like, they've taken out Hitler, that he's buried down there. Anyway, I thought that was pretty awesome. So if you remember back to some of the scenes I showed out of movies too, it was originally 10-man crews. But eventually, by the time you got to 1944, I guess the Luftwaffe had been beat up enough. They switched that to conserve manpower and 9-man crew. So where originally they had 2 waist gunners back in kind of that middle belly part of the plane, they switched it where one guy could cover both of those machine guns. Unfortunately, the guy that was the second waist gunner on my papa's crew got switched to a different crew, and he didn't end up surviving the war. His plane went down. Now, you had to fly 30 missions to complete your tour of duty. Once you flew 30 missions, you were done. It didn't necessarily mean you're out of the military, but you're going to get rotated out. And it's kind of like that's the light at the end of the tunnel. Because if you're just told that you have to fly combat missions until either you die or the war is over, that's a pretty depressing, heavy thing to wrestle with. But if you know that, like, man, if I make it through 30 missions, that gives guys hope. And, they're shooting for that. Now, 30 missions was 30 missions. So once you flew 30 combat missions, you were done for, and you got to get out of there. And let me actually skip ahead here. Here's the list of all the combat missions that Papa Houston flew in. Now, you could go and sub on other crews because apparently a lot of times, one crew might take a hit and one of their gunners dies, or one person on the crew, and they're looking for a substitute to come in. So other crews might occasionally need another top turret gunner. Papa Houston could have went and signed up for sub duty like that and flown extra missions, and that would have got him his 30 quicker and got him out of there. However, he said that he knew guys that were doing that. They wanted to get back home. They wanted to be done with the war. And when they were flying on one of these, like the sub crews and going and filling in, he knew some guys that got shot down and died on those missions. And he kind of felt like, and I guess this was kind of the consensus amongst his whole crew, that, man, we work good together. We trust each other. We're a lead plane. We put our lives on the line together. He wanted to just stick and fly with his crew and not rush it. He was worried that if he did try to rush it and get out of there quicker, something might go bad on another crew that wasn't as disciplined or highly trained as the crew that he was a part of. And he does make it through the war, so probably a wise decision there. Now, you'll notice Papa Houston flew 29 missions. So I had asked, well, what happened to the 30th mission? I thought you completed your tour of duty. Well, it was actually his pilot one time did fly a substitute mission with a different crew, and you as a crew were kind of based on and went with your pilot. So because they were so close, his pilot had flew 30 missions. The rest of the guys on the crew, they completed their tour of duty with 29 combat missions. One of the last combat missions he flew, and this actually, they were flying right up to like the spring of 1945, which is right when the war does wrap up. He basically flew his last combat mission several weeks before the war was over. I believe on mission 25 in Jena. That was one that, like, we're right towards the end of the war, where they hit a target for the Soviets that actually kind of opened up the floodgates and allowed the Red Army to come in and surround Berlin, and kind of, as a final knife in the back for Nazi Germany, and led to and kind of sped up the downfall and end of the war. Another thing, I guess he knew guys that were on ground crews as mechanics that if they flew if they transferred and got onto combat duty, they potentially could finish their tour of duty sooner. So he knew some guys that had transferred in and started flying, and then got shot down and died. And remember that, like, being on a bomber crew in the 8th Air Force, statistically, that was one of the most dangerous jobs that you could do during the war. Now, another thing I remember Papa Houston talking to me about a lot as a kid, he always said multiple times to me that his heart really went out to, and he specifically named my other grandpa, Grandpa Stan. He said, my heart always went out to guys like your Grandpa Stan that were out there in the front lines, fighting in the rain, the snow, the sleet, seeing the enemy face to face, out there cold. That, that he felt like they had a rough go of it too, because you're out there fighting. You would get time to sleep and get rotated out, but you're out there day and night for extended periods of time. Whereas my grandpa's Papa Houston's experience was, he was, a lot of his time was fairly comfy at a base in southern England with a warm bed and, always having meals. So that's kind of the trade-off. If you're in the 8th Air Force on a bomber crew, you're going to live a little more comfortably than the average soldier out on the front lines. But the downside to it is, when you go do a combat mission, you're doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, and the likelihood of you getting shot down, becoming a POW, or even more likely that you just get shot down and killed, those go way up. So kind of a trade-off there. We had talked about that a little bit in World War I and World War II, but I thought, that's kind of worth mentioning. Another story from Papa Houston, he said that, when he was up on a combat mission one time, bomber squadrons would get P-51 Mustangs that would escort them, be a bomber escort. And if the German Luftwaffe showed up, your P-51s, the American planes, would go fight them off. That one time they were coming into the bomb run and the anti-aircraft guns were going off. And I guess Papa Houston every so often you'd have to do checks and look at different points in the sky, and he swiveled his turret back, and he saw, a P-51 Mustang was right up flying next, almost like level with his bomber plane. And the P-51 kind of tipped his wings and waved at him, and he could see the pilot in there, and he kind of tipped his guns a little bit and gave him a wave back. And then he went over and did a check the other way, and by the time he looked back over, that P-51 Mustang was gone, and it hadn't flown off. It had taken a direct hit from one of the anti-aircraft guns, and it was gone. That pilot was done for. There's no ejecting there or, coming down with a parachute. And he said that was a pretty chilling experience too, seeing somebody that he had just made eye contact with, and seconds later, bam, that guy's a goner. Just to let you know how dangerous that job was. Now, we've talked a little bit in the past, but it's worth recovering real quick. The conditions up on those bomber planes that, it's cold. You're flying miles up in the sky, so you have sub-zero temperatures. That's why these guys had thick leather coats with wool liners in them, those cool bomber jackets. It's so loud. I mean, this isn't like flying in a modern day jet with a pressurized cabin. You have windows open and everything. It's loud. You hear the roar of the engines, and you can't really hear the guy standing right next to you. That's one thing that's often not portrayed accurately in the movies, where they have guys, always taking their comm sets off and talking back and forth. That was one thing when I watched Memphis Belle as a kid with Papa Houston. He pointed out, he was like, that didn't happen like that. That you had to have your comm set on, and then you kind of had a walkie-talkie type system where anything you said into your comm set, everybody else on the crew could hear too, and it would help you call out enemy fighter planes, and captain could give orders from there. But if you took that comm set off, you were oblivious to what else was going on within, even on your own plane and in your crew. My grandpa said, or Papa Houston said, that one time he had taken his comm set off, and he said it was his fault, just kind of being lazy. It was uncomfortable, didn't want to have it on, was taking a break from it. But he also had it was either his parachute or a flak jacket on, big kind of vest around him. And he was in doing his checks and looking in the top turret. And as he was going to get out, somehow his jacket or vest got caught on the, like the control, that it was kind of almost like a joystick of sorts, that controlled the swiveling of the turret. And it got him caught in there, and the turret wanted to swivel, and this hydraulic press pinched him in it, in his chest and back. He was pinched into that turret, and he couldn't, the way he couldn't unfree himself or get it loose. And he is literally like 5 feet away from the pilot and co-pilot. And I guess he was screaming at them, yelling at them, like, hey, help me. And they couldn't hear him. They were oblivious to it. So think about that. That's kind of almost inside the cabin of the plane. But that's how loud it is up there, that he's 5 feet away, right behind him, screaming at him, and they couldn't hear him at all. And eventually, I guess the co-pilot ended up turning around for something else, saw Papa Houston there, went and got him unhooked and said, don't take your comm set off, right? And he said he learned his lesson there, and that was the last time he took his comm set off. He made sure he kept that on, because if he had that on, he could have talked right in it and somebody would have got him out right away. But I guess he was bruised up pretty bad, and learning his lesson the hard way on that. So I think I've hit most of Papa Houston's highlight reel. And just like I had said for my Grandpa Stan, really for both of them, this isn't all of their experiences from the war. Of course, they were over there for a very long period of time, but these are a lot of the stories that I remember them talking to me about when I was a child. So both of my grandfathers were pretty open about their experiences in the war. I think they also kind of tamed it down and tempered it for me, because a lot of the times when I was hearing these stories, I was elementary, junior high, even high school age, and kind of through my formative years. But they were pretty open about it, which I really appreciated. And my grandpa's sharing these stories with me when I was young really is a big part of why I ended up becoming a history teacher and got so into learning about history. It was something that was programmed into me and really engaged me and hooked me in when I was pretty young. So I want to emphasize and just kind of close up with, boy, I love these guys and have tremendous respect for them. Both of my grandfathers and my grandmothers too, and really my whole family, except for maybe Uncle Scott. Just kidding. I love them all. I have a great family and have been totally blessed there. So awesome experiences all around, at least from my part. I'm sure it was a little bit traumatic for my grandfathers when they were going through it, but man, it was cool for me as a kid to grow up and hear these stories. And I'm hoping that by me recording them this way and releasing it as an extra credit opportunity, you guys enjoy them too, and take advantage of it, get some bonus points, and maybe this will be something that you take with you. And maybe go out there and look into some of your family's stories and see what some of your relatives have done and the experiences that they've gone through. All right, take care.